Hi all, I'm Gabriela Houston. Welcome to my show where we talk about storytelling in all its forms. Today's guest is Chris Panatier, a Texan author and artist. He writes short stories and novels, plays, drums, and draws album covers for metal bands. His third novel, The Redemption of Morgan Bright, is coming out from Angry Robot Books in April 2024. So Chris, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, my friend, who I've known for a long time now. Can I say
Yeah.
can I say we're old friends since we've known each other for 3 years?
You
I think that's
can,
old
you
friends.
can.
Yeah.
I feel like, I would be passing myself as far more impressive person if I was just like, no, these people are just like my
That's
old
right.
friends. All of these people are my old friends. So I wanted to sort of start not with your books, not with your art, but like with your early career, because you're one of those people who just sort of shows the rest of us up by being successful in all the things that you just pick up. And you were a very successful lawyer before you sort of ever sold a book. So do you want to sort of tell us a bit about that and like how you came to sort of move towards the arts from being a lawyer, and how did that go?
Sure. Well, I've always had a creative side that I've always kind of fed, even when I was practicing law. But the and not to the exclusion of law. I mean, I'm a trial lawyer, and you talk about your podcast here is it a podcast? What is it? Is it a channel podcast? What is it?
It's a YouTube show and a podcast.
Okay, so your media of many dimensions. When it's about stories, and when I was young, I was a debater in high school. I loved yapping and yammering on and arguing and all that. And so I ended up going to law school and then becoming a trial lawyer, where I represented people who were hurt by big companies. And I did that for 2 decades. I still do it, although I'm phasing out of it for a lot of different reasons. The main one being that I worked for 20 years traveling all across the United States and trying cases in a million different places. And you can only do that so long before you absolutely burn out. And that's what happened to me. There's a lot I still love about it, but I'm moving into other things. And then I also have, I've got a daughter who you've met, and I want to be there for her. So it's a lot of things. And then the last bit is I happened to find a passion for writing as I was losing my passion for being a lawyer full time. So as a trial lawyer, you're telling a story. You look at all the evidence, you put it together, and you tell the best story you can tell that is in line with the evidence and is a fair piecing together of what all the evidence tells you the story is. And sometimes that's going through, over 1 million documents from a company and seeing really, really what happened. And so I've always been interested in story, and story is the most powerful thing out there. If you tell a jury, if you just say this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened to a jury, that has a certain amount of influence. But if you connect them and you explain why, you tell the story, it's a lot more powerful. And so, I've kind of phased out of that type of storytelling into absolutely some of the strangest fiction, I've come across, because, the other part of this is that I didn't really begin reading fiction until very late. I was always a nonfiction person. I read tons of science. I loved science, which of course is why I've written some science fiction. I read, I would pick up Scientific American in the airport, read it, understand 5% of it, but love every bit of it. And I guess that was sort of filling the tank for, some future sci-fi that I wrote. And then over the past, I guess, I started writing. I decided I was going to start writing in 2015. So over the last almost 9 years now, I've been reading nonstop to catch up on everything that I wasn't reading beforehand. Yeah, I read some fiction. I read some stories. I read a little as a kid. Mainly I lied about what I read as a kid, because we'd have to give a book report. And I'm like, I'm not doing that. I'm not reading a book. Look how many pages that is, you know.
No,
So,
your degrry is going to be revoked now.
yeah, exactly. I really had a sea change in my in just sort of how much work I was willing to put in and where my interests fell. And yeah, that's sort of what happened.
That's really interesting. There's been quite a bit of research done in the recent years about how men tend to read nonfiction a lot more than they do fiction, and there's those theories that boys and men are told from a very young age that they should sort of monetize all of their time and all of their efforts, and that reading fiction is sort of just fluff that is reserved for girls, and that you know, real men read nonfiction. And it's really interesting how, like, when, you know, because being a lawyer, obviously not, you know, maybe not the type that you know, you described, like, you know, working on behalf of people who have been hurt by big companies. But when people think lawyer, they think, you know, someone who is working hard to monetize on their skills and on their abilities to sort of retell the stories and to create a narrative that allows their clients to win, put quite simply. And, you know, as you talk about your passion for that profession sort of waning a little bit, that's when you sort of turned towards the fiction sort of side of reading. And I feel like that could be seen as quite an interesting connection, because it's kind of, you're letting go of that sort of mindset about monetizing everything, about being very kind of business oriented, and sort of moving more towards your artsy side and just embracing that enjoyment.
What you say is actually, you make a very salient point. It wasn't so much, it wasn't directly about monetizing things. What it was it was actually worse, I think. I think it was. I think I had a idea in my head that I don't know where it came from, starting back in high school, that anything that wasn't real, grounded in the real world, was a waste of time. And that if there were still things to learn about the real world, why would you spend any time reading something that was made up? And that's very strange coming from, you know, someone who, you know, I've been drawing album art, made up crazy fantastical stuff for even longer than I've been writing. But I had this very myopic kind of narrow view. And I will tell you this, I've learned more about humanity and reality from fiction than I ever have from nonfiction.
Yes.
And I think the reason is that it's not just a reporting what happened. It happens or has happened. It's an exploration of what can happen and how humans handle certain things in certain situations. So it doesn't matter if you're talking about, you know, the relationship between an orc and an astronaut. If you explore that relationship, you're going to learn about human nature. So I've learned much more about the human condition from fiction than I have from nonfiction.
Absolutely. It's about, I feel like also it allows you to kind of connect with people of different mindsets in a way that is very important these days, because people are so divided in this kind of, and regardless of where they sort of sit in their political beliefs, there's this idea that you cannot even communicate with the other side. And that is, and that you have to kind of adhere to all the belief system of your particular group. And I feel like fiction does allow for this sort of rehumanizing of the other and rehumanizing of people who you sort of avoid in everyday life, and to allow us to sort of see their point of view as not just wrong, it's just different. And I think because there's this charity in the UK called the Empathy Lab, and they do a lot of really interesting work. They work with sort of research centers, neurological research centers, and they build their work on actual sort of neurological research to do with how our brains allow us to feel empathy. And some of the work they do in schools is to kind of try and promote reading as a way of building empathy. And there's research done that shows that, when you have two people connected, the brains are under a scan, and one person is smelling cinnamon and the other person just reads the word cinnamon, and the same areas in their brain light up.
Yeah.
And that is building block of like be able to first experience the emotion that you read about. That is this building block for empathy building through fiction.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah.
So I mean, you as a lawyer, you were also exposed to a lot of very personal stories, and like a lot of,
Sure.
when you're talking about people who you represented, you were on some pretty big cases in the last, couple decades, to do with sort of corporate malpractice. And, you had to process a lot of the stories, personal stories that were told to you. How did you handle that? And do you feel like it kind of fueled your storytelling, sort of your urge to do storytelling of your own later on?
Yeah, absolutely. I learned one of the most important lessons about empathy in representing people over all those years. You want your jury to empathize with, to understand, and to, of course, sympathize with your clients, your people who have been hurt. And early on, when I was a baby lawyer, I saw big, important grown-up lawyers, and they would put their clients on the stand, and they would ask them very generic questions about, like, these people, the people I represented almost uniformly had terminal cancer. So they were going to die, or they were already dead, and their spouse would testify. And you want the jury to sense the loss, because the jury has to evaluate that loss, and then they award compensation for it. That's how the legal system works. It's money is the currency of the legal system. And so you want them to empathize with either your client who is dying or their loved ones who are left behind. And so often I saw these very generic questions. When did you get married? How long were you married? Where did you go on your honeymoon? Did you love each other? Yes. Are you going to miss them? Yes. Okay, great. I mean, that's all very generic. That could apply to anybody. And one of the things I started to do probably about 15 years ago was I was like, I really want the juries to feel like they know these people and to want good for them. And so I went away from all of the big poetic paintbrush stuff. And I started when I would prepare my clients, you talk to them ahead of time, you get them ready, you tell them the types of questions you're going to ask. I would give them homework, and I would say, here's your homework. Your homework is, I want you guys to think about a really embarrassing or a really funny story between you. And think about it. Don't say anything now. Tell me later, and then we'll tell the jury. And invariably, you're with someone long enough, there's plenty of that stuff. That would happen. And I would have them recount to the jury what they told me. And just one little example is, I had a client named Clyde Fisher, and he had died, and his wife was left behind. She lived in a nursing home. She was all alone. And we put her on video. She didn't even come to trial. She was too old to travel. And I asked her, I said, now, when you and Clyde wanted to get married, isn't it true that you broke the law? And she was like, yes. I said, well, tell us how. She said, well, in Ohio, when we were young, you needed parental permission. You need permission to get married before the age of 21. and we were not 21. I was 20. And we ran off and we went to the minister and we tried to get married. And they said, well, are you 21? And she said, no. And he said, well, I can't marry you. So they went to another place, and her fiance's brother said, hey, before you go in, take this piece of paper. And he wrote the word 21 on it. And he said, put it in your shoe. And she put it in her shoe. And when the guy said, whether he was a justice of the peace or whatever, when he said, well, how old are you? She said, I'm standing on 21. And he asked no further questions, and they got married. And the reason I love that is because she did something that was technically bad because she broke the law, but it was for an amazing reason. And juries, after that, case was over. The jury was going to find for her no matter what. And in fact, there's all these different elements of damages. There's pain and suffering. There's the loss of your spouse for the surviving spouse. And they awarded her $2.1 million. And the foreperson came up to me afterwards and he said, you tell her that's her number. We did that for her. She's still standing on 21. And that made a huge connection. And so when I try to write relationships, I try to go, what little details can I put in that will tell the reader who these people are and make the reader love them? And it can be something where they did something wrong, but they did it for the right reasons. And just little things like that. And I would tell other juries, look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, this is the loss of love and tell you poems. No, what is love? Love is that someone else made you coffee in the morning, that they took something that you had planned to do, that was something you didn't really want to do, and they did it for you. Little teeny things over and over and over again. That's love.
I mean, when you put it like that, it sounds like fantastic writer training that you've had in your sort of first career.
Yeah.
I was wondering actually, how when you're sort of saying it, if it could be argued that the reliance on emotional stories is a limitation of the legal system as well in the kind of jury system, because the reason I said there was again, there was research done on how well a computer fares compared to a judge when it comes to bail hearings. It was done in the States. I was reading about it in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking to Strangers. And the context, the bigger context of that was that we're terribly bad at being able to tell if someone's telling the truth or lying, and that humans are sort of, in evolutionary sense, set up to just not be able to tell. And computers sort of outperformed judges, but by a factor of like 100 when it came to whether the decision was or wasn't correct at the end of bail hearings, when it comes to who actually went out and who was allowed out and reoffended, who skipped bail, and we are basing a lot of our decisions in terms of, like a lot of decisions are made in courtrooms, in parliaments around the globe based on kind of more emotive side of things. We're telling stories, we're telling anecdotes, and obviously in the cases that you have tried, I think most people could agree that the end result was very much correct. But did you ever feel like it was kind of pulling stories out of people in a way that, like, well, the judge and the jury should just be able to look at the evidence? This caused someone to get sick, this caused someone to die, and they should be able to make a decision without all those stories and without forcing people to recall certain things on stand.
Well, so to flesh out what you have to prove to win a case. you have to prove that the thing that happened to them was caused by the defendant. You can't just go in and tell a sob story and say, I feel bad, and my client had a sweet story she told about getting married.
Of course, yeah.
You actually have to prove causation, and you have to do it in multiple different ways. And when people talk to me about the legal system in the United States, I make it very clear that by the time you see a case in front of a jury, the defendant has had multiple opportunities to have that case thrown out. Multiple. And if you're there in front of the jury, there's a credibility to that case.
Of course.
Okay. Now, I have, of course, lost cases. Anybody who says they've never lost a case isn't trying a lot of cases.
Or is only trying the easy cases.
Only the easy ones.
Yeah.
And I've lost cases. When I have lost and I've interviewed the jury, most often I may disagree with them. I may not agree with their decision, but most often I can understand why they did it. There was something that happened in the trial, or there was some weakness in the case that they hung their hat on. And I could understand why they did that. The point you make about the computers versus the judges in bail hearings, I'm not familiar with that, but I will say that a jury gets to know, in a civil case or in a criminal case, a jury usually has, especially in a big civil case, many weeks to get to know the players and to get to know the people and the witnesses and the parties. And so they're not making snap judgments typically on credibility. And sometimes credibility flips depending on something that might happen. I've had many juries say, because especially early in my career, I had a very young face. I had juries that would nickname me Harry Potter or Chucky even.
Chucky, okay.
Chucky. And in those cases, let me tell you, when you get a nickname,
as in the doll,
as in the doll, you usually win if they nickname you. It means they like you, even if they give you a negative nickname. But what I heard from many of them was, when they first saw me, because I looked so young, they didn't give me a lot of credibility. They would look to the guy on the other side or the woman on the other side who was much older, with their glasses at the tip of their nose and looking very, very learned. And they would associate them with credibility first. And then over the course of the trial, it would go something like this. Because the one thing I always stood on was, I'm going to tell you the truth. And I would repeatedly own bad facts for me in front of the jury and be like, hey, look, this is something you need to know. Like, for instance, I represented clients that were lifelong drug addicts. Okay. Had nothing to do with the actual disease they got. The disease being, in many cases, mesothelioma from asbestos. Drugs don't cause that. But the fact that they're a heavy drug user, some jurors might be, might have a bias or a prejudice against that.
You anticipate any kind of negative.
So it's called, you own, there's a very undelicate saying that you own the ugly baby, right? Every case has an ugly baby and you own it. And that's because, guess what? Not everybody's life is a fairy tale, and telling the truth carries so much weight. I'll give you an example. I had a client at the time, he had mesothelioma. He was gonna die, but at the time of trial, he was still alive. And this guy was this good old boy from Fresno, California. He had a mullet. He rode motorcycles. And every morning, he was still going to work. He wasn't fully, the cancer hadn't fully taken over yet. Every morning, he would get a big gulp from 7-Eleven, right? The convenience store over here.
Whoa, a big gulp.
A big gulp is a colossal cup. It's like 72. It's like 72 ounces or something. He would fill it with Coca-Cola. Right?
Oh, okay.
And then sprinkle crystal meth in it.
Oh.
No joke. No joke.
Wow.
And this is so funny. This is so hilarious. So we tried to keep that out because we're like, Judge, that has nothing to do with the case. The defendants only want it in because they know the jury will hate him for it. But it has nothing to do with the case. It didn't cause his disease, whatever. Well, the judge was like, I'm going to let it in. So when I picked the jury, I told them my client has used drugs, still uses drugs, you know, is there anybody who believes, hey, I can't be fair in this case because of that? And there was a few people, and they got off the jury. But then when we tried the case, I needed to put it in front of them, and I needed to explain it. And the night before he testified, I was like, okay, so I was like, Steve, this is weird. I've never heard of anybody sprinkling crystal meth in their Coke. Why do you do it? And he was like, well, I still work 16-hour shifts, and I've got terminal cancer. So, and I was like, that's a pretty good answer, honestly, right? Like,
Yeah, I
whatever.
mean,
He knows he's going to die.
Straight to the point, and I feel like
but then,
it's quite disarming.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that makes perfect sense. I was like, great. But then we put him on the stand, and he gets nervous. And when it comes to the question, why do you put crystal meth in your Coke? He leans into the microphone and he just goes, I like to party. And the jury like busts up laughing. They absolutely love him. And we win the case, you know? Wow. And so he's admitting to illegal conduct, right? He's admitting to a conduct that a lot of people really, really hate. But he had a reason for doing it. And of course, the stated reason at trial was even more like hilarious. It was so honest, even though it wasn't the actual reason he did it. He just got nervous, right? And the jury was like, we love this guy. So anyway, so there's the assumption that you have to present the perfect family or the perfect person, the model citizen to make people empathize or like you is completely false.
I don't think that's necessarily the assumption. I think just to tie it up with your writing, actually, because I think that's a good point that you made, is that a weird story can make us, or a story that has nothing to do with the case can really change our perception in a positive way about a character, in a way that has very little to do with logic or sort of rational thinking. You know, there's nothing intrinsically likable about a guy who does crystal meth every morning. Right. But the way that it was presented introduces an element of humor. And I think it's like Marilyn Monroe said, like, a man who can make you laugh can make you do anything.
Right.
You know, and it's like humor of this kind is very much present in your writing, in the Stringers, especially, which is your kind of humorous sci-fi novel, which, I mean, it's so grotesque, but it also has moments of poignancy to it in a way that is completely unexpected. And were you thinking about stories like that, like from earlier, that you were?
Yeah, there's a few books I've read over the years that I was like, you know, for me, the goal in writing a story is I want to have some penny drop moments. I want to have huge emotional punches, whether they make you sad or make you happy. I want these things to unfold in this like beautiful way that when it hits you, it's just, you're like, oh, you have to shut the book and just appreciate it for a minute. And I've read some of those books, and they just, you know, they're the ones that stick with you. I mean, one of the books I read the longest ago was probably like his Dark Materials, and in which my daughter is named for. So in the third book, there is a passage, it's one paragraph, and it describes Lyra, the main character, describes her passage from childhood to adulthood in one paragraph. And it has this house analogy about the lights coming on. And it's like one of the most heavy, amazing things I've ever read. And when I read that, I was like, I want to try in everything I write to have a moment of that quality. And even in Stringers, which is a funny and disgusting kind of space opera romp,
Maybe not
I
disgusting, grotesque.
grotesque. Yeah.
Let's lean into the
Yeah.
grotesque.
There's some gross stuff in there. But what happens to this one character who's a fairly, not a super likable character, what happens to this character when it happens, and the sacrifice he makes, and sort of how it comes about, to me, I hope is one of those moments. And and then another book that's a great example of having one of those moments is The Last House on Needless Street by Katrina Ward, who lives there in the UK. And that one had another one that just absolutely blew me away. Just it's a twist, but it's also a revelation that isn't just a twist. It casts everything else in a different light. And I love moves like that. And so I'm always trying for something like that. If it's in the story, there are stories where it's not appropriate, where it's a different type of story, right? But if it's correct for the story, I'm always looking for that. I'm always like, is there one of those here? And that's sort of for me, the apex of storytelling is trying to create those moments.
Yeah, I mean, it's that juxtaposition of the grotesque and the poignant is very much sort of visible in the Stringers, but also in The Redemption of Morgan Bright. This one is a much slower and more thoughtful book in some ways than your previous ones. Can you tell us a bit more about it, about how it came about and what the story is about?
Sure. So The Redemption of Morgan Bright, it comes out in April of 2024. And the sort of elevator pitch is a woman's sister dies while under the care of a asylum. And so she doesn't get any answers about what happened to her sister. So she creates a false identity and has herself committed to find them herself. And it is a contemporary, I would call it a contemporary Gothic. It's not dated, but it is contemporary / near future. It pulls quite a bit from what's going on right now in my country and certainly the world at large, having to do with women. But it is on the surface, it is a psychological and paranormal asylum story.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good book, and everybody should all go and pre-order it. It's very, very different again from your previous books, The Stringers and The Phlebotomist. Indeed, like each of your books seems to explore a new subgenre, even while remaining within the sort of speculative fiction, under the speculative fiction umbrella. So what drives you to those diverse styles? Are you just trying different things, or do you see it as an evolution of your writing?
I see it as more than anything, an evolution. Like, when I started writing seriously back in 2015, I gravitated to the things that really, really fascinated me, made me interested, which at the time was mainly astronomy and astrophysics and stuff like that. And so the first two books were very science-based. Funny though, all along, I was also writing lots of short stories. And without trying, what I realized was that probably 90% of my short stories were horror. I mean, straight up horror. And I never really put two and two together that maybe I should try writing a horror novel. And then when my daughter was 4, we were driving along. It's so crazy how one little nugget can become an entire book. We were driving along and she saw a giant blow up Darth Vader with a candy cane lightsaber. And it was around Christmas. Huge, like 20 feet
festive,
tall. Like,
very festive. Yeah.
Like, this is America. There's people put giant blow up stuff in their yards. The bigger, the better. And she didn't know who Darth Vader was. And she pointed and she said, "Oh, I love it when we pass the Christmas witch." And I was like, the Christmas witch. Ooh, I love those two words together. I love that. And so I was like, I'm going to figure out a way to write a book that's titled The Christmas Witch. Okay. And I just started brainstorming, and I came up with a asylum story about a woman who fakes her way into an asylum. That's where the comparisons end.
I love how your brain sort of jumps from Christmas Witch to a dark asylum horror because
the original, yeah.
I mean, the link is not immediately apparent.
I originally had the story was going to be that this woman fakes her way in a Nellie Bly sort of way to report on the conditions. It was going to be a fairly explicit Nellie Bly retelling.
Can you, for those of the listeners who don't actually know about Nellie Bly, could you sort of talk about a bit more?
Well, her real name was Elizabeth Jane Cochran, and she's actually who I've dedicated The Redemption of Morgan Bright to. But Nellie Bly, this is utterly shocking. It's so audacious. It's one of those things that I want to pour out the nearest alcoholic beverage out of respect, because at 23 years old, in 1890, I think it was 1893 or 1897, Nellie Bly was a young journalist who convinced her editor to let her commit herself to one of the most notorious state asylums for women in New York. And so she did. And predictably, they believed she was legitimately out of her mind. And they tried to keep her
the bar was low. The bar for the diagnosis was extremely low. It has to be noted.
Yes, extremely low. Yes. And in fact, she wrote a book afterwards called 10 Days in a Madhouse. And she said, as soon as I got in, I acted normal, right? She put on an act to get committed. And then she said, I just acted like myself. And they were like, no, you are positively demented. Those are their words. And her editor had to come and rescue her. They were going to keep her there. So first of all, like, the guts to go and do that is amazing in the late 1800s in a state asylum. That's crazy. But that's who she is. And that was sort of the device I used to have Morgan have herself, to conduct her investigation about her sister. But it's not it wasn't for journalistic purposes. It was for familial reason why she did it.
I loved that, when we're talking about it's contemporary, but it's slightly kind of where it could go once more with women's rights and the way women are sort of looked upon, that she convinces her friend to, it's not a spoiler because right at the beginning of the book, she convinces her friend to kind of act as her husband to get herself committed. And so only he can write her out. And that was, of course, the law in England for a very long time. So your father or your husband had the absolute power to get you committed if he so wished. And there were women, up until the 20th century, who were in those horrific asylums, with a diagnosis of moral insanity, for example, because, they like to wink at a sailor. That was that kind of, that was all that was required really for a diagnosis. And you have sort of tied it in a similar way to how, like Margaret Atwood in The Handmaid's Tale, everything that she described has already happened to women or is happening somewhere to women.
Right.
And she just brought it in a context that, we hope that we're kind of past that, even though we're quite evidently not.
So she resurrected, of course, a very, straight ahead, unnuanced, version of women's servitude. I resurrected, like you brought up, the laws in England where a husband or father could have their daughter or wife just committed because they felt like it, really. There were some of those in the US too. They died out for the most part in the 1800s. But for the purposes of this book, I resurrected it in the state of Nebraska, that everybody gets due process. They get hearings and all of this if they're going to be involuntarily committed, with the exception of the ability of a husband to have his wife committed. And it's interesting. Some people who have read it have said, well, I just don't believe that this could happen. And this is the danger of stopping teaching history and people not learning history, because you know, they used to wear miniskirts in Iran, and just because you obtain a right doesn't mean it can't be taken away. And of course, they're telling me this literally after Roe versus Wade has been overturned in the United States.
Yes,
and
of course.
And states like Nebraska and Texas, where I live, are trying to pass laws to outlaw no-fault divorce, meaning that you have to go prove to a judge that you should be able to get a divorce from your husband. Now, theoretically, the husband would have to do the same thing, but we know how those laws are generally applied. This is not, they're not being written and proposed by white male lawmakers so that it makes it harder for them to divorce their wives. It's to make it harder for wives to divorce them. And yes, that is utterly terrifying. And already there are towns in Texas, and I'm sure other states, that have made it illegal to travel through them if you are leaving the state to go get reproductive care. So for anybody who says, I don't believe that this can happen, crack a history book or look out the window.
Yes, I think it's a wider issue of not understanding that there's context to everything that could be beyond the context you know. And I think that I think the fact that people have become progressively more and more unwilling to accept that there is context they might not be familiar with, either culturally or factually or historically, is really narrowing our point of view. And it was something I was I was talking to someone the other day about how you have this yearly return of the Baby It's Cold Outside song debate. But basically anybody who is familiar with any kind of culture, you know, cultural texts or films or anything from the time when the song was written, understands the context that, you know, women were not allowed socially to express sexual desire in such an obvious way. And so they had to go through all the stages of this kind of denial. And, you know, oh, it's like, what's in this drink? It doesn't mean that it was roofied. It's like, this strong is so strong. Yeah, I'm throwing caution to the wind, you know. I was just talking about it with someone the other day, and it's the same kind of applying understanding that there might be something you're not seeing, and instead of looking for what you're not seeing, you just assume that it doesn't exist. And I think that, you know, stories that kind of bring those other contexts in are so important as well, because it allows you, even especially when they just hint at something you don't understand, it allows you to sort of expand your horizons a little bit and thinking like, oh, maybe there's something I should look into. Maybe there's something that I have not considered.
Well, and it's interesting you say that. There was someone who read The Redemption of Morgan Bright during revisions, a male, and he said some things as he was reading it, because I saw his comments, and it was very interesting to see the evolution of those comments throughout the book. He had a very different perspective, one that I would describe as somewhat, I don't know, shuttered. And if the reason, you know, I might write a book like The Redemption of Morgan Bright with an allegory, as an allegory, is hopefully to confront people and maybe make them, maybe not change minds, but maybe just open eyes. Just open your eyes, you know.
I think Yes, like I think that is a far loftier goal than trying to change someone's mind, because I feel like anytime you're like, and writers do that a lot these days, when they preach at a reader or try to
Right.
bend their story towards convincing someone of something, or they have some particular argument from social media in their head and they are kind of shoehorning it into a story.
Yeah.
I think it creates a real sense of dissonance, and in the reader who, like, who can actually suddenly sense the narrator, they can sense the author behind the story.
Right.
And it's far less effective than just telling the story straight.
Well, it's very interesting you say that, because you, of course, read an early version of The Redemption of Morgan Bright, and you made a comment to me about one passage. I still remember it very clearly, where you were like, this took me out of it because this character seems to be giving a lecture. And as soon as you said it, it was one of those things where I was like, yeah, I needed to hear that. You're right. You're right. It's actually less effective if you conk someone over the head than if they come out of it with the story and they don't realize that maybe they've learned a couple of things, and so I would much rather try to just open people's eyes a little bit without going, ha ha, look at this right here, and also look, first and foremost, this is a book. It is a form of entertainment.
Yes.
And that's first and foremost. If you can, and I think most people strive to, if you can have a little bit of a theme, if you can have a little bit of a point that you're making, that's great. But it shouldn't just shout at you, because that pulls the reader out. And first and foremost, you're telling a story.
And the thing is that, the same story, two different people with different views will take two different completely messages from a story. And that is fine. Like, in my mind, like, I am, the older I get, the less convinced I am that I have all the right answers, sadly. It's like Oscar Wilde, totally. Sort of, I'm not young enough to know everything, it's,
I love that.
It's, and I feel like trying to actively change someone's mind through my story is an act of arrogance. It would be an act of arrogance on my side, because I don't feel like I'm not really qualified to go in and change someone's value system.
It might even be counterproductive.
And it would, like, I think in many cases is completely, certainly for me, if I feel like the book is quoting Twitter, I'm about to throw it across the room and and never pick up anything by that author again. So and I think that there is sometimes this tendency to kind of, well, let's present a version that will correspond to our story, rather than allowing the characters to tell you what the story is, which is far more effective in my view.
Yeah, I agree with you.
When you're talking about the evolution in your writing, obviously the earlier books had a lot more humor in it. Do you feel like you might go back to it? Or do you feel like you are really set on kind of pursuing the more kind of, how would you put it, like psychological horror sort of side?
I really, really, really love exploring things that I don't believe in. So like The Redemption of Morgan Bright is a paranormal thriller, gothic thing. And oh my God, my dogs. Can you hear them?
No.
Good.
Oh, okay. Yes. Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah. I heard the bark. That's fine.
Yeah. Sorry, you might have to edit. You might have to edit that out. The mailman.
Sound effects. Sound effects.
Okay. The great nemesis of dogs everywhere. So with The Redemption of Morgan Bright, I love presenting something that evokes a sense of wonder, and mystery is where wonder is. I truly believe. And a great example of this, and I have emulated this where I can, as best as Chris Panatier can, but a writer I think that does that just amazingly, and probably the best example of it of his writing is Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer, where there is this thing that has happened, and it is not explained to you what it is. You can try to figure out what it is. I think the answers actually are there, but there's this sense of wonder and amazement to it. And something like that happens in The Redemption of Morgan Bright. And you are given clues as to what it is, but I don't bonk you over the head with it and just explain it, because to explain it all is to remove any wonder, to remove any mystery. So to answer your question, I want to explore those things, and I do think I want to continue to do it through horror. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not going to inject humor in the stories. Now, in Redemption of Morgan Bright, there are some scenes, there are parts that are prose, straight prose. There's some text message conversations, and there are some police interview transcripts. And there's this police detective and there's a station doctor that are in a lot of the scenes together. And those two, if there's any comedy relief in the book, it's those two. Basically, they spend a lot of time clowning on each other's professions. One is a psychologist and or a psychiatrist, and one is a cop. And to watch them sort of mess with each other about the other one's profession there's some comedy relief there. And there's also some dark comedy in it. But first and foremost, I was trying to write a disturbing, scary horror novel. And, and that is where where I see my direction going right now. This year I've written a horror novella, which actually is I would call it a humorous horror. It's funny. And I don't know, we'll see whenever that one sees the
I look forward to reading it.
Yeah. And then I just finished another one that I'm revising now that is a haunted house, family in a haunted house. I would call it a thriller as much as it's horror. And of course there's funny moments of it too. I think humor and horror are opposite sides of the same coin. So, but first and foremost, I've set out to write scary stories. Stringers was this whole thing is funny, and you're going to have some poignant moments to it, and hopefully some bigger picture, emotional hits. But it's funny throughout. If you share my sense of humor, some people don't. Some people don't like it. But for me, that was the book that I was like, this is the funny book. It had to come out. I had to get it out of me. It's always been in me. And right now I'm exploring more horror again, to go back to what we said at the beginning, to sort of explore the human condition. I think horror does that really, really well.
Yeah, I agree. Apart from your writing, you're obviously also an extremely accomplished artist, and you have sort of publicly credited your love of music for influencing your art. And even in your biography, right, in inverted commas, I don't know why the inverted commas, but you play the drums. Like, you play the drums, that's what you like to do. We don't need to sort of couch it in any terms. You do what you do. So, you have your love of music, and you illustrate a lot of sort of metal band sort of album covers as well. And your art is very on the one hand, it's very representative. It's quite like realistic, but it has this grotesque, again, extravagance about it, with this sort of fantastical element. And I really feel like, when I see a new piece of artwork that you create, it definitely does tell a story, and it does tell a story that might have no point in it. I don't know, but it's something that draws you in, and you kind of follow the line work of your art, and you sort of try to understand what comes out of what. And there's a lot, there's a lot of skulls, there's like a horror-esque element to it. Like, how did you come to do that, and sort of how did you tie music with your art?
Well, specifically, I'm a huge metalhead, and what I love about the metal genre is that it is unapologetically permissive, meaning that you can sing about whatever you want. You can explore whatever you want. You're not going to get judged for it. You may play your songs to a room of 0 people, and that's fine. You've explored something. And what I love about it is the fearlessness of, you have a whole genre of metal where they just sing about pirates. Okay, that's real. There's troll metal. There's
Wow, I never
Viking.
knew that.
Oh yeah, 100%. Fin Troll is the band I'm thinking about there, and then there's Teresa's, Ailstorm, some other pirate metal bands. Metal has an incredible sense of humor, but unless you're really paying attention, you might just go, "This sounds angry to me," when it's absolutely not. They might be singing a song about meeting a gnome in a tavern, and I love that, because to me, horror is, and I think I even put this in the acknowledgments for Redemption Morgan Bright, metal is music's horror genre, right? And I love the experimentation. I love trying new things and exploring, because I think that all reflects back on us. What we explore and how deep we dig reflects back on us as human beings, and we learn more about ourselves. And I think metal does that too, if you're paying attention to the lyrics. And so I credit metal because I don't think it has any boundaries. And so I always, when I write a story, I always want to go, now within a story, I think that once you set up a premise, once you set it in a direction, it has boundaries. It does have boundaries. And what I have taken from listening to a lot of metal is making sure I push that story to those boundaries. You don't want to go beyond them, because you could hurt the story that way. You take the reader out.
Yeah.
But I always want to make sure that whatever's there to explore, that I explore it and I flesh it out. And I've used this analogy before, but I just love this analogy of, you could paint a room with a roller, and if no one's looking really, really close, it looks pretty good, but you usually miss the corners. And whenever I've got a scene or a story element or a character, I try to pause and say, did you paint to the corners? Did you fill in the corners? Did you really get every ounce out of this that you could get? And that's my way of policing myself, to see if I really just wrung out every bit of juice that was in there. And I think that there's a lot of metal music I listen to where they get every ounce out of that, either the lyrics, the story in the song, or the music itself. Sometimes I listen and I'm like, you only played that really, really amazing riff 2 times through, man. Play it 4 times through. Like, let's get all the juice out of this that you can.
That's interesting, because it's literally as a sort of discipline of rigor, it's the opposite of what people think when they talk about discipline in writing, or discipline in, or rigor in writing. Because usually people think about in terms of restraint and kind of keeping things, keeping the things that we don't need out, keeping to the boundaries. Whereas it's really interesting when you talk about music and writing. It's almost like almost the opposite of that. It's like, have you explored everything there is to explore? And it sounds like there's a great deal of joy and freedom in that approach as well.
Oh yeah, totally. And of course, look, when it comes down to it, if you want to tell a story that people want to read and that will tell other people to read, it's got to be a story that's cohesive, right?
Of
you
course.
Can't just throw a bunch of crap at the wall. But within the story you've told, have you explored what needed to be explored? Because often I'll see where someone had something going. I'll see this in stories all the time. They really had something going, and I'm like, oh, I feel like this is really going to pay off, and it kind of dies on the vine.
I see, yeah.
And sometimes I feel like if they had just explored it a little longer, spent a little more time on going, where should this really go, it would have bloomed completely. And I think that's what we're trying to do.
I think on that note, we could continue having this conversation and filling in the corners
Yeah.
for much longer, but our time is up. So thank you so much, Chris, and everybody. You should pre-order The Redemption of Morgan Bright. It's a really fascinating story, and check out Chris's Instagram as well, where he posts a lot of his artwork. I'll post a link to it in the podcast description. So
Gabriela, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I always love talking to you. It's always interesting.
thank you so much, and the same to you. And I can't wait to have you over again for the next book that you release.
Of course, I know. I'm excited for more scones. I was just telling a scone story to someone the other day about how you told me I had 2 scones and you were like, take a third scone. I said, I'm full. And you said, you're a grown man. And I had that third scone.
Yes. Although you did pick the little one, please do not think that it went unnoticed.
Of course not. No, I did pick the little one. I did. They were still the best scones I've ever had. They were amazing.
I do like to overfeed people.
That's a fact.
All right, thanks. So if you like the show, please hit the subscribe button. It really helps the channel, and maybe that notification bell too. And see you again next week.